The phone rang at 3 in the morning, and Maya knew before she picked it up that something was wrong. Her hands were shaking as she reached for it on the nightstand. Daniel was not beside her. He had not been beside her in months, sleeping instead in the guest room down the hall, a habit that had started as an excuse about snoring and had quietly become permanent. She looked at the screen. It was her sister, Claire. "Maya, it's Dad," Claire said, her voice breaking. "You need to come now." That was how the story of Maya Bennett's marriage truly began. Not with a wedding, not with a proposal, but with a phone call in the dark that would force her to face just how alone she had become inside a marriage that was supposed to protect her from being alone. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and called out for Daniel. He did not answer. She walked down the hall and found the guest room empty, the bed made, untouched. Her husband was not home. It was 3 in the morning, and she did not know where he was. And worse, she realized, as she stood there in the quiet house, she was not even surprised. 6 years earlier, everything had started very differently. Maya was 24 when her father, Walter Bennett, sat her down in the kitchen of the house she grew up in and told her that the family business, the small but respected furniture company he had built from nothing, was in trouble. Not failing exactly, but drowning in debt that had piled up quietly over several bad years. The only way out, the only way to save 40 years of his life's work and the jobs of the dozen people who depended on it, was a partnership with another family in the same trade, the Hartleys. The Hartleys had money. What they wanted, Walter explained carefully, watching his daughter's face, was not just an investment. Old man Edwin Hartley wanted his son settled, married, rooted. He believed a man with a wife and a household could not be reckless with money the way his son, Daniel, had been for years. "He's not asking us to sell the company," Walter said. "He's asking for a marriage, between you and his son." Maya remembered laughing at first, thinking it was some kind of joke, the kind of thing that belonged in old novels, not in her actual life, in a mid-sized American town in a modern century. But her father's face did not change, and slowly, the laughter died in her throat. "You don't have to do this," he told her, and she could see how much it cost him to say it, how much he hated even asking. "I will find another way if I have to." But Maya had seen the numbers. She had grown up watching her father build that company with his own hands, watching him come home, smelling of sawdust and pride. She had watched 12 families depend on paychecks that came from that business, and she understood, in the quiet way people understand the shape of their own sacrifice before they fully feel the weight of it, that there was no other way, not really, not in the time they had. She met Daniel Hartley for the first time 2 weeks later, at a dinner arranged by both families at a restaurant downtown. He was tall, well-dressed, handsome in an obvious sort of way, and completely uninterested in being there. He barely looked at her through the appetizer course. He answered his father's questions in short sentences, and spent most of the meal checking his phone under the table, thinking no one noticed. Maya noticed. She noticed everything that night, filing it away the way a person does when they are trying to convince themselves a decision is not a mistake. After dinner, as the fathers shook hands and made plans neither of their children had agreed to, Daniel finally spoke to her directly for the first time. "You know this is not my idea," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. It was simply a fact he was stating, the way a person might mention the weather. "I know," Maya said. "It's not mine either." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Then I suppose we understand each other." She thought, foolishly, that understanding was a kind of beginning. She thought two people who both knew the truth of their situation might build something honest out of it, even if it did not start with love. She did not yet understand that for Daniel, that conversation was not a beginning at all. It was a door he was closing, politely, before it had even opened. The wedding happened 4 months later. It was smaller than either family's business standing might have suggested, held in a garden behind the Hartley estate, with maybe 60 guests, string lights overhead, and a string quartet playing songs Maya had picked because she thought they were pretty, not because they meant anything to her. Daniel stood at the altar in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, and when Maya walked toward him in her mother's old wedding dress altered to fit her frame, he offered her a small, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself a lot of things that day. The vows were traditional, promises to honor and support, spoken clearly and without hesitation by both of them, because whatever else was true, neither Maya nor Daniel were people who did things halfway, even things they had not chosen for themselves. When the officiant pronounced them married, Daniel kissed her, brief and correct, and the guests applauded. And somewhere in the crowd her father was crying, and Maya told herself that this was a good thing, a brave thing, a sacrifice worth making. She held on to that belief through the reception, through the toasts, through the drive to the airport the next morning for a honeymoon, in a coastal town neither of them had chosen with any excitement, simply because it was expected that newly married couples went somewhere. It was on that honeymoon, on the third night, sitting across from Daniel at a restaurant table overlooking the water, candles between them, that Maya first understood the true shape of what she had agreed to. She had asked him a simple question, something about his childhood, trying to build a bridge between them, the way strangers do when they are trying to become something else. He had answered in 2 sentences, and then picked up his phone to check something related to work, not looking up again for the rest of the appetizer course. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "Are we going to try? To actually be married, I mean, not just say the words." He set the phone down and looked at her, and for a moment she thought she saw something soften in his expression. But when he spoke, his voice was even, careful, the voice of a man delivering a business decision, rather than a truth about his heart. "I'm going to be a good husband on paper," he said. "I'll provide. I'll be respectful. I won't embarrass you or the families. But I did not choose this, Maya. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve false hope." "So what does that mean?" she asked. "For us? It means we build a life that works," he said. "It doesn't have to be everything other people's marriages are. It just has to function." She remembered nodding at the time, remembered telling herself that function was not nothing, that a foundation, even a cold one, could be built upon later, warmed later, given time and patience and effort. She remembered believing, with the stubborn hope of a woman only 24 years old, that if she simply loved him well enough, consistently enough, eventually he would have no choice but to love her back. She did not yet know that hope, when it is not met with any effort from the other side, does not build a marriage. It only builds exhaustion. They returned from the honeymoon and moved into a house the Hartleys had purchased for them on the quieter side of town. A beautiful house with high ceilings and large windows that let in more light than Maya knew what to do with. She threw herself into making it a home. She learned to cook the dishes Daniel had grown up eating, the ones his mother mentioned once at a dinner, filed away carefully in Maya's memory the way she filed away everything about him, hungry for any detail that might help her understand the man she had married. For the first few weeks, there was a kind of peace between them. Daniel came home at reasonable hours. They ate dinner together most nights, made small talk about their days, watched television side by side on the couch, not touching, but present. Maya told herself this was the beginning of something, a slow thaw, and she was patient the way water is patient with stone. But the weeks became months, and the pattern that emerged was not a thaw. It was a routine, and routines, Maya was learning, could be their own kind of distance. Daniel began staying later at the office, first by an hour, then 2, then arriving home after Maya had already eaten dinner alone at the table set for 2. He always had reasons, and the reasons always sounded plausible. Meetings that ran long, deals that needed closing, his father's expectations weighing on him in ways Maya could only imagine because he never spoke about them directly. She learned not to ask too many questions. Not because he asked her to stop, but because his answers grew shorter each time, edged with something that felt like irritation, and she did not want to become a woman who nagged, who chased, who made herself small and desperate in the eyes of a husband who had already told her, plainly, at that restaurant table on their honeymoon, exactly what she should expect. Still, she tried. On their first anniversary, she planned a quiet dinner at home, cooked his favorite meal, bought a small gift she had thought carefully about for weeks. Daniel came home 2 hours late, having forgotten the date entirely, and when he saw the candles and the table set with care, something crossed his face that might have been guilt, quickly buried beneath an apology that sounded rehearsed even as he said it. "I'm sorry," he said. "Work has been a lot. I'll make it up to you." He never did. Not that time, and not the times after. when other anniversaries and birthdays slipped past him, like water past a stone that had stopped noticing the river at all. Maya's sister Claire noticed first, the way sisters often do, seeing the small changes that accumulate slowly enough to be invisible to the person living inside them. It was Claire who pointed out, gently, over coffee one afternoon, that Maya had stopped talking about Daniel, the way a wife talks about a husband she loves. She had started talking about him the way an employee talks about a difficult employer, careful, managing, waiting for approval that rarely came. "Does he even ask about your day?" Claire asked. Maya opened her mouth to defend him, the way she always did, and found that for the first time, she could not think of an answer that was actually true. She began confiding in Claire more after that, small things at first, the missed dinners, the silence at the table, and later, larger things, the loneliness that had started to feel less like a phase and more like the permanent temperature of her life. Claire listened without judgment, but Maya could see the worry gathering behind her sister's eyes each time. Worry that Maya was too afraid to feel fully herself, because feeling it fully would mean admitting that the sacrifice she had made for her father's company was costing her more than she had ever agreed to pay. She threw herself into other things instead. She had once studied art in college before the marriage arrangement had pulled her away from finishing her degree, and she began painting again in a small room upstairs that Daniel never entered, filling canvases with colors that felt like the only honest conversation she was having with anyone. She joined a community group that restored old furniture for families in need. A small irony she noticed, but never mentioned to Daniel, whose own family had built an empire on furniture, while she gave pieces of it away for free to strangers who needed it more. She was not, she told herself during those early years, unhappy exactly. She was simply waiting. Waiting for Daniel to notice the effort she put into their life together. Waiting for the day he would come home and truly see her, not as an obligation fulfilled, not as a business arrangement honored, but as a woman who had built an entire life around the hope of being loved by him. She did not yet know how many years that waiting would ask of her, or what it would eventually cost her to keep believing the wait would end. On the night her father called with news that would change everything, Maya had been married to Daniel for exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She knew the number exactly, because she had, without quite admitting it to herself, begun counting the days the way a person counts anything they are afraid might run out. She stood in the hallway of the too large, too quiet house that night, holding her phone, waiting for her father's voice to tell her what was wrong, and for one strange, clear moment, she felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time. She felt afraid, not of the bad news coming through the phone, but of the realization settling cold and certain in her chest, that if something happened to her father tonight, she would have to face it completely alone, in a house with another person's name on the deed, married to a man who did not know where she kept her late mother's photographs, married to a man who was, at that very moment, somewhere in the city she could not name, having not come home at all. Her father's voice on the phone was tight with fear that night, but the news, when it came, was not the worst news. Walter Bennett had suffered a mild heart episode at his workshop and had been taken to the hospital, stable but shaken, the doctors keeping him overnight for observation. Maya drove there herself, alone, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, her mind circling back again and again to the empty guest room and the husband who was nowhere to be found. She found her father sitting up in a hospital bed, pale but alert, Claire already at his side holding his hand. He looked smaller than Maya remembered, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of him, a reminder that the man who had built an entire company from nothing, the man whose sacrifice had shaped the entire course of her life, was not invincible after all. "I'm fine," he said, before she could even ask, his voice hoarse but steady. "Stop looking at me like that. You scared us," Claire said, squeezing his hand. Maya sat on the other side of the bed, and for a while, the three of them simply stayed like that, quiet, grateful, the machines beeping softly in the background. It was Claire who finally asked, gently, where Daniel was. Maya felt her face grow warm. "I don't know," she admitted. "He wasn't home when Claire called. I tried his phone twice on the way here." Her father's eyes, tired as they were, sharpened slightly at that. He did not say anything, not that night, with tubes in his arm and worry still etched into every line of his face. But Maya saw the flicker of something pass through his expression, something that looked almost like guilt. as if he were doing the same math she had been doing quietly for 2 years, weighing what he had asked of her against what she had actually received in return. Daniel finally called back around 6 in the morning, as Maya sat in an uncomfortable hospital chair, exhaustion pulling at every part of her. His voice was groggy, confused, asking why she had called so many times. "My father had a heart episode," she said flatly. "He's stable. I'm at the hospital." There was a pause on the line, long enough that Maya could hear him shifting, could hear the sound of him sitting up somewhere, could hear, faintly, another voice in the background asking a question she could not make out. "I'll come now," Daniel said finally. "Where were you?" she asked, and hated herself instantly for asking, hated the small, pleading note that crept into her voice, despite every effort to keep it out. "I was out with people from the office," he said. "It got late. I fell asleep at a colleague's place. I'm sorry, Maya. I'll be there soon." He arrived at the hospital an hour later, dressed in yesterday's clothes, hair slightly disheveled, offering a version of concern for her father that felt correct on the surface but hollow underneath, like a performance of the emotion rather than the emotion itself. Walter thanked him politely for coming. Claire barely looked at him. Maya watched the whole exchange from a distance that had nothing to do with physical space, feeling for the first time not just lonely, but truly separate from the man she had married, as if an invisible wall had finally become visible enough to see the shape of. They drove home together in silence that stretched the entire length of the highway. Maya stared out the window at the gray early morning light, replaying the phone call, the pause before his explanation, the other voice she could not identify. She did not ask him about it directly. She was too tired, too raw, and some small, self-protective part of her did not want to know the answer badly enough to risk the fight that asking might bring. When they got home, Daniel showered and changed and left for the office within the hour, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if his wife had not spent the night alone in a hospital waiting room while he was somewhere she could not name. Maya stood in the kitchen after he left, staring at the coffee cup he had abandoned half full on the counter, and felt something inside her shift, quiet but permanent, like a foundation, settling after years of pressure it had not been built to bear. She did not confront him that week, or the week after. She told herself she was being patient, that her father's health scare had rattled everyone, that this was not the moment to add more weight to an already heavy season. But patience, she was beginning to understand, had become the primary skill of her marriage, the thing she practiced daily, the way other women practiced love, and she was growing tired in a way that sleep could not fix. Her father recovered well, thankfully, and within a month he was back at the workshop, moving slower than before but still himself, still the man who had built something out of nothing through sheer will. Maya visited him often in those weeks, grateful simply to sit in his presence, to breathe the sawdust and varnish smell that had defined her childhood, to feel, for a few hours at a time, like herself, instead of like a woman managing the emotional weather of a marriage that gave her almost nothing back. It was during one of these visits that her father finally said the thing Maya had been both hoping for and dreading for 2 years. "I made a mistake," he said quietly, not looking up from the piece of wood he was sanding by hand out of old habit, even though the company now had machines that could do the work in half the time. "Asking you to marry into that family. I told myself it was the only way, and maybe it was, for the business, but I should have found another way to protect you too." Maya felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and sudden. "Dad, don't." "I watch you," he said, finally looking at her, his eyes older than she remembered them being before the heart episode, as if that single frightening night had aged him years in the space of hours. "You used to laugh more, Maya. You used to talk about your painting like it was the best part of your day. Now you talk about it like it's the only part." She did not have an answer for that, because it was true, and there was no way to argue with a truth spoken so plainly by someone who loved her enough to risk saying it. "I'm not asking you to leave him," her father continued carefully. "That's not my decision to make, and I would never ask you to blow up your life to fix a mistake I made. But I need you to know that whatever happens, whatever you decide, the company is stable now. It's not perfect, but it's stable. You don't owe anyone your happiness anymore, if you ever really did." Maya left the workshop that day carrying something new, a small, dangerous seed of permission she had not realized she was waiting for. She drove home slowly, turning her father's words over in her mind, testing the weight of them against 2 years of quiet accumulated disappointment. That night, she waited up for Daniel, something she had mostly stopped doing over the past year, because waiting had so rarely been rewarded with anything but more waiting. He came home at 9, earlier than usual, and seemed surprised to find her sitting at the kitchen table instead of already upstairs. "You're up," he said, setting his bag down. "I wanted to talk to you," Maya said, and she was proud, in a small, distant way, of how steady her voice sounded. "About us. About what this marriage actually is." Something guarded moved across his face, the same guarded look he had worn on their first dinner together years earlier, before either of them had said a word about the arrangement out loud. "Okay," he said. "What about it?" "I've been patient," Maya said. "I want you to know that. I've tried to make this work, even when it felt like I was the only one trying. I told myself that was enough, that eventually you would meet me halfway. But I don't think that's happening, Daniel, and I need to know if it ever will." He was quiet for a long moment, standing there in the kitchen with his jacket still half off his shoulders, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something Maya had rarely heard from him before, something that sounded almost like exhaustion of his own. "I don't know how to give you what you want," he said. "I told you from the beginning I didn't choose this. I've tried to be fair. I've tried not to make it worse than it has to be. But I don't know how to make myself feel something I don't feel, Maya. I wish I did." The honesty of it should have hurt more than it did, Maya thought later, lying awake that night listening to the unfamiliar silence of Daniel actually sleeping down the hall, instead of being out somewhere unnamed. But there was a strange relief buried inside the pain, the relief of finally hearing, in plain unmistakable words, the truth she had suspected for 2 years, but had never let herself fully believe. He was not going to change. He had told her that on their honeymoon, and every year since had simply been proof of a promise he was keeping. The wrong kind of promise. The one that cost her everything and gave him nothing to lose. She did not leave him that week, or that year. Change, she was learning, rarely happens in the moment of realization. It happens slowly afterward, in the quiet accumulation of decisions made once the truth can no longer be unseen. But something had shifted permanently in her that night in the kitchen. A hinge that had finally been found, and finally been turned, even if the door itself would take years more to fully open. For now, she simply nodded, thanked him for his honesty, and went upstairs alone, carrying with her the first real clarity she had felt in longer than she could remember, the clarity of knowing exactly what she was dealing with, instead of hoping desperately that it might one day be something else. The following spring brought a change to the Hartley household that Maya had not expected, one that would briefly convince her, against every lesson the previous years had taught her, that things might still turn around. Edwin Hartley, Daniel's father, was diagnosed with a serious illness that required extensive treatment, and almost overnight, the confident, controlling patriarch who had orchestrated Maya's entire marriage from behind the scenes became a frightened man facing his own mortality. Daniel, who had spent years performing distance from Maya with practiced ease, suddenly found himself unable to perform distance from his own fear. He came to her one evening, weeks into his father's treatment, and sat down across from her at the kitchen table, without any of his usual guardedness. His eyes were red, his shoulders slumped in a way Maya had never seen from him before. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to lose him." Maya did not think about the years of silence, the missed anniversaries, the countless nights alone. In that moment, she simply saw a frightened man who needed someone, and some part of her, the part that had never fully stopped hoping despite everything, reached across the table and took his hand. For the next several months, something shifted between them. Daniel leaned on Maya in ways he never had before, calling her from the hospital during his father's treatments, asking her opinion on decisions, sitting beside her on the couch in the evenings, not out of habit, but because he seemed to genuinely want to be near her. They took a short trip together during a break in his father's treatment schedule, a quiet weekend at a lake house that belonged to a family friend, and for the first time in their marriage, Maya felt something that resembled real closeness. They walked along the water in the evenings. Daniel actually talked, about his childhood, about the pressure of being an only son in a family that measured worth by achievement, about a version of himself he had buried so deep under obligation that he had almost forgotten it existed. Maya listened, and for the first time she understood something about the man she had married, understood that his coldness had never truly been about her, that it had been a wall built long before she ever entered his life, a wall built to survive a childhood that had never let him simply be a person instead of an heir. On the last night of that trip, sitting together on the dock under a sky full of stars neither of them had time to notice in the city, Daniel turned to her and said something Maya had waited 5 years to hear. "I think I've been unfair to you," he said. "I think I let myself believe that being distant was the same as being honest. But it wasn't fair to you, Maya. You didn't choose this any more than I did. And you tried, every single day, in ways I never let myself see." Maya felt tears she had not expected rise in her throat. "I just wanted us to be real," she said. "I never needed it to be perfect. I just needed it to be real." "I want to try," Daniel said. "Really try. Not because my father is sick, though I won't pretend that hasn't changed something in me. I want to try because I think, somewhere in the last 5 years, I stopped seeing you as an obligation and started seeing you as someone I actually don't want to lose." That night, for the first time in longer than Maya could remember, she went to sleep beside her husband instead of alone in a house too large for one person's loneliness, and she allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that everything the previous years had cost her might finally be repaid. Edwin Hartley's treatment, against difficult odds, eventually succeeded. Within 6 months he was declared in remission, his strength slowly returning, his booming, confident presence gradually filling the family gatherings again, the way it always had before his diagnosis. Maya remembered feeling genuine relief at the news, both for Daniel's sake and because she had grown, in those frightening months, to care about the old man in a way she had not expected. But relief, she would soon learn, is not the same as safety, and the closeness that crisis had built between her and Daniel proved far more fragile than either of them had promised each other on that dock under the stars. It began slowly, the way most retreats begin, with small excuses that seemed reasonable on their own. Daniel returned to the office full-time as his father's health improved, taking back responsibilities he had let slide during the crisis, responsibilities that came, once again, with long hours and late nights. Maya told herself this was temporary, that he was simply catching up, that the closeness they had built would resume once the immediate pressure passed. It did not resume. Instead, the late nights grew later. The conversations grew shorter. Daniel began sleeping in the guest room again, first citing exhaustion from the long hours, then not citing any reason at all, simply drifting back into the pattern, as if the months on the dock, the months of holding her hand in hospital hallways, had been a temporary detour rather than a genuine turn. Maya watched it happen with a clarity that hurt more than the original coldness ever had, because now she knew exactly what closeness with Daniel felt like, and the contrast made the returning distance unbearable in a new way. She tried, at first, to talk to him about it the way she had before, sitting him down, asking gently what had changed. "Nothing's changed," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm just busy, Maya. It's not the same as before." But it was the same as before, and they both knew it, and the difference this time was that Maya no longer had the excuse of not knowing what was possible between them. She had seen it. She had held it in her hands on a dock under the stars, and watching it slip away again felt like grieving something twice. Once when it never existed, and once when it had briefly existed, and then chosen to leave. She confided in Claire again during those months, describing the whiplash of it, the cruelty of hope offered, and then quietly withdrawn. "He let you believe," Claire said, anger sharpening her voice in a way it rarely did. "And then he just went back to how it was before, like it cost him nothing." "Maybe it didn't," Maya said quietly, and hearing herself say it out loud was its own kind of devastation. She began to notice other things too, small details that on their own might have meant nothing, but together formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Daniel's phone, once left carelessly on the counter, now stayed with him constantly, even in the shower, even overnight. He grew irritated when she asked simple questions about his day, questions that would once have received short but civil answers, and now received nothing but a tightening jaw and a change of subject. He started attending work events that never seemed to include spouses, though other colleagues' wives mentioned, in passing conversations at family gatherings, that they had been at the very same events. Maya did not confront him with these observations directly, not yet. Instead, she began quietly gathering them, the way a person gathers evidence not because they want to prosecute, but because they need, finally, to believe their own eyes, instead of doubting themselves for the 100th time. It was at a family dinner at the Hartley estate, nearly a year after the lake house trip, that the final piece fell into place. Edwin, fully recovered and back to his commanding self, made an offhand comment over dessert about a colleague of Daniel's, a woman named Priya who had apparently been assigned to several of Daniel's recent projects. "Sharp woman," Edwin said approvingly, oblivious to the way Maya's fork had gone still in her hand. "Daniel speaks highly of her, says she's been a great help these past months." Maya glanced at Daniel across the table. He did not meet her eyes. He reached for his water glass instead, and something in the careful, deliberate way he avoided her gaze told Maya everything the past year of small details had been building toward. She said nothing at the table. She smiled, made polite conversation, helped clear the dishes the way she always did, the good daughter-in-law, the patient wife. But in the car on the way home, sitting beside a husband who had returned so completely to silence that the months on the dock felt like they belonged to a different lifetime, Maya finally allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding for months. "Who is Priya?" she asked, keeping her voice level, watching the streetlights pass over Daniel's face in rhythmic waves of light and shadow. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "A colleague," he said. "We work together." "Your father says you speak highly of her." "My father talks too much," Daniel said, an edge entering his voice that told Maya she had struck something true. She did not push further that night. She was learning, slowly, painfully, that pushing had never once earned her the truth from Daniel, only more distance, more careful evasion, more silence, dressed up as reasonable explanation. Instead, she filed the name away, Priya, alongside all the other small details, and she waited, the way she had learned to wait, for the moment when the truth would become too large to hide any longer. She did not yet know how soon that moment would come, or how completely it would finally end the waiting that had defined her entire married life. The name Priya stayed with Maya through the following weeks, like a splinter she could not stop touching. She told herself, at first, that she was imagining connections that did not exist, that a colleague's name mentioned once over dessert did not mean anything sinister, that she had been made suspicious by years of loneliness and was now seeing shadows where there was only ordinary work life. But the small details continued to accumulate, and Maya had spent enough years studying her husband's habits, out of necessity rather than choice, to know when something in the pattern had changed. Daniel's phone calls, once conducted openly in shared spaces of the house, now happened behind the closed door of his home office. He began traveling more for work, trips that lasted 2 or 3 days, and were explained in only the vaguest terms. He grew thinner, in a way that suggested stress rather than illness. And when Maya asked if everything was all right, he answered with the same clipped, closed-off tone he had used to answer every difficult question for the past 6 years. She did not confront him again directly, not for a while. Instead, she did something she had never done before in her marriage. She began paying closer attention, not out of jealousy exactly, though there was some of that too, but out of a growing need to finally understand the full truth of the life she was living, rather than continuing to accept whatever version of it Daniel found convenient to offer her. It was Claire, ultimately, who gave her the final piece of the puzzle, though neither of them intended for it to happen the way it did. Claire worked in a marketing firm downtown, and one afternoon, meeting Maya for lunch near her office, she mentioned, entirely in passing, that she had seen Daniel the previous week at a restaurant 2 blocks from her building, seated at a corner table with a woman Claire did not recognize, their heads bent close together over the table, in a way that struck Claire, even from a distance, as more intimate than a simple business lunch. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Claire admitted, watching Maya's face carefully. "But then I remembered what you told me, about the name your father-in-law mentioned. I don't know if it means anything, Maya, but I thought you should know." Maya sat very still for a long moment, feeling something settle inside her chest that was equal parts heartbreak and, strangely, relief. The uncertainty had been its own kind of torment for months, the exhausting work of not knowing whether she was imagining things or seeing clearly. Now, at least, she had somewhere solid to stand, even if the ground beneath her was breaking apart. What did she look like? Maya asked quietly. Claire described a woman around Daniel's age, professionally dressed, dark hair pulled back neatly, an easy laugh that had carried across the restaurant even from where Claire had been seated. It matched nothing Maya could confirm, and everything Maya had already suspected. She did not go home that night and confront Daniel in a fury, though every instinct told her that was exactly what a betrayed wife was supposed to do. Instead, she sat with the information for several days, turning it over carefully, trying to decide not whether it was true, because some quiet certain part of her already knew it was, but what she wanted to do about it now that she knew. She thought about her father, about the sacrifice that had begun this entire marriage, about the years she had spent trying to build something real, out of an arrangement neither she nor Daniel had chosen. She thought about the months at the lake house, the hope she had allowed herself to feel, the way that hope had been quietly, cruelly withdrawn, once the crisis that created it had passed. And she thought, most of all, about the version of herself that had existed before any of this. The young woman who painted for hours without checking the clock, who laughed easily, who believed she deserved to be truly seen by whoever she chose to spend her life with. That woman, Maya realized with a clarity that felt almost physical, had been slowly disappearing for 6 years, replaced by someone smaller, someone who had organized her entire emotional life around waiting for a man who had told her, plainly, on their honeymoon, exactly how little he intended to give. She decided, finally, that she needed proof before she said anything, not because she doubted Claire's account, but because she needed, for her own sake, to see the truth with her own eyes, rather than build her next decision on second-hand information. It was a decision that would take her, over the following days, into territory she never imagined her careful, patient life would lead her toward. She began, quietly, to watch her husband's patterns more closely than she ever had before. She noted the days he claimed to be working late. She noted the restaurant Claire had mentioned, researching it online until she found its hours and its layout, learning that it had a small side entrance often used by people who did not want to be seen entering through the main doors. On a Thursday evening, when Daniel told her he would be working late on a project deadline, Maya told him she was going to visit Claire for dinner, a plan that was, for the first time in a long while, entirely untrue. Instead, she drove to the restaurant Claire had described and parked across the street, her heart pounding in a way that felt almost like fear, though she could not have said exactly what she was afraid of finding, or perhaps more honestly, what she was afraid of not finding, of discovering that her suspicion had been wrong, and that the growing distance in her marriage had no explanation at all beyond the simple, exhausting truth that Daniel had never wanted her in the first place. She did not have to wait long. Just after 7, she watched Daniel's car pull into the small lot beside the restaurant. She watched him step out, straighten his jacket, and walk toward the side entrance Maya had researched, the one that avoided the main dining room windows. A few minutes later, a woman arrived on foot, dark hair pulled back neatly, dressed professionally, but with none of the rigid formality of an actual work meeting, and disappeared through the same side entrance. Maya sat in her car for a long time after that, not crying, though she had expected to, simply sitting very still, feeling something inside her that had been slowly cracking for years finally, quietly, break all the way through. She did not go inside. She did not create a scene, did not confront them at the table the way she imagined, in some distant dramatic version of herself she might have. Instead, she started her car, drove home, and sat alone in the too large, too quiet house that had never once, in 6 years, felt like it truly belonged to her. When Daniel came home just after 11 that night, tired and distracted, offering the same tired explanation about work he always offered, Maya was sitting in the living room in the dark, waiting for him, not with tears or accusations ready on her tongue, but with something far more dangerous to the life he had built for himself. She was waiting with clarity, the kind that comes only after hope has finally, completely, run out. Daniel flipped on the living room light and stopped short when he saw her sitting there, still in her coat, hands folded in her lap, eyes calm in a way that seemed to unsettle him more than tears ever could have. "Maya," he said carefully, "what's wrong?" "I saw you," she said, her voice steady, almost gentle, which somehow made the words land harder than if she had shouted them. "Tonight, at the restaurant near Claire's office. I saw you go in through the side door. I saw her arrive a few minutes later." The color drained from Daniel's face. For a long moment he said nothing at all, standing frozen in the doorway of the living room he had barely spent time in over the past 6 years. And Maya watched him search, visibly, for an explanation that might still work, might still be believable, might still let him avoid the conversation neither of them had ever truly had. "It's not what you think," he finally said, and Maya almost laughed at how tired the words sounded even as he spoke them, as if some part of him already knew how hollow they were. "Don't," she said quietly. "Please don't do that. I've spent 6 years accepting explanations that made me feel small, Daniel. I'm not doing it again tonight." He sank down onto the armchair across from her, running a hand through his hair, and for a while the only sound in the house was the quiet tick of the clock in the hallway, a sound Maya had grown so used to over the years that she barely noticed it anymore, except in moments like this one, when the silence between two people became so heavy that even small sounds felt enormous. "Her name is Priya," he said finally. "We started working together about a year ago, during my father's illness. During the time you told me you wanted to try," Maya said, and it was not a question. Daniel flinched, actual visible pain crossing his face, and for a moment Maya almost felt sorry for him, before she remembered, sharply, that the pain he was feeling now was a fraction of what she had absorbed quietly for 6 years, without ever once being asked how she was carrying it. "I meant that," he said. "When I said it, on the dock, I meant it. I don't know exactly when it changed. I think I got scared, honestly, of how much I actually wanted to try, and it felt easier to retreat than to keep showing up for something I wasn't sure I knew how to do." "So you found someone else to show up for instead," Maya said. He did not deny it. That, more than anything else that night, told Maya everything she needed to know. A man defending himself argues. A man ready to change promises. Daniel simply sat there, quiet, guilty, offering nothing but the confirmation she had already gathered with her own eyes, outside that restaurant. "How long?" Maya asked. "Has it been more than working together?" "A few months," Daniel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to happen, Maya. I know that sounds like an excuse. I know it is an excuse. But I was lonely, and she was there, and she made me feel like I wasn't just an obligation my father had arranged. She made me feel like someone actually chose me." The irony of that statement struck Maya so hard she had to close her eyes for a moment. 6 years. She had spent 6 years trying desperately to make Daniel feel chosen, to make him feel wanted beyond the arrangement that had brought them together, and it had taken another woman only a few months to give him something Maya's entire married life had failed to provide. Not because Maya had not tried hard enough, she understood now with sudden startling clarity, but because Daniel had never once let her efforts land. He had built a wall long before Maya arrived in his life, and he had chosen, deliberately, whom to let through it and whom to keep shut out. "I gave you everything I had," Maya said quietly, and for the first time that night, her voice trembled slightly, though her eyes remained dry. "I learned to cook the meals your mother mentioned once. I decorated this entire house around what I thought might make you comfortable enough to actually live in it with me. I waited up for you more nights than I can count. I told myself, every single time you pulled away, that I just needed to try harder, be more patient, be someone worth staying for. And this whole time you were choosing, every day, not to let any of it in." "I know," Daniel said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words, the closest thing to real emotion Maya had heard from him in longer than she could remember. "I know, and I don't have a good enough explanation for you. I'm sorry, Maya. I know that doesn't fix anything." "No," Maya agreed, "it doesn't." They sat in silence for a while longer, the clock in the hallway marking time. Neither of them seemed to know how to fill. Maya thought about all the versions of this conversation she had imagined over the years. In quiet moments of doubt she had never allowed herself to fully explore, and none of them had prepared her for how calm she actually felt now that the truth was finally, completely, out in the open. There was grief, yes, a deep, aching grief, for the years she had spent hoping, for the version of her marriage she had wanted so badly to build. But underneath the grief, she was surprised to find something else entirely, something that felt almost like relief, the relief of no longer having to guess, no longer having to wonder if she was imagining her own loneliness, no longer having to carry the exhausting weight of hope that had never once been matched. "I need you to leave," Maya said finally. "Not forever necessarily. I don't know what forever looks like yet. But tonight, I need you to go somewhere else. I need to think. And I can't think clearly with you in this house." Daniel did not argue. He gathered a bag of clothes quietly and left within the hour, driving off into the same darkness Maya had once spent countless nights wondering about. Except now the wondering was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow certainty that felt, in its own way, like the beginning of something rather than only an ending. Maya sat alone in the living room for a long time after he left, listening to the silence of the house settle around her. A silence that had always felt like abandonment before, and now, strangely, felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space, for the first time in 6 years, that belonged entirely to her. She did not call Claire that night, though she knew her sister would want to know immediately. She did not call her father either. Not yet. Not until she had a clearer sense of what she actually wanted to say, beyond the raw fact of betrayal. Instead, she went upstairs to the small room where she kept her paints, the room Daniel had never once entered in 6 years of marriage, and she sat down in front of an old, half-finished canvas she had abandoned months earlier, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she picked up a brush not because she needed an escape from her life, but because she finally, quietly, wanted to build something that was only, entirely, hers. The weeks that followed moved slower than any Maya had experienced in years, each day stretching out with a strange, unfamiliar quality, as if time itself had shifted once the central lie of her marriage had finally collapsed. Daniel stayed with a friend from work, calling occasionally, always careful, always polite, asking how she was doing in a tone that suggested he genuinely did not know the answer, and was, for the first time, afraid to guess. Maya told her father the truth 2 days after that night in the living room, sitting across from him at the kitchen table of the house she had grown up in, watching his face carefully as she spoke. She had expected anger, perhaps even guilt renewed and doubled, since it was his arrangement that had placed her in Daniel's path to begin with. What she found instead was a quiet, steady sadness, and beneath it, something that looked almost like pride. "You didn't fall apart," he said, once she had finished. "I watched you carry that marriage for 6 years, giving more than you ever got back, and I was afraid, if this day ever came, it would break you completely. But it hasn't, has it?" Maya thought about the question for a long moment, before answering honestly. "I don't know yet what it's done to me," she said. "But I know I'm not the same person who married him. I don't think I want to be her again, even if I could." Her father reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had when she was a child, and the world felt too large to face alone. "Then don't be her again," he said simply. "Be whoever you're becoming instead." Those words stayed with Maya through the following weeks, becoming something like a compass as she navigated the strange new terrain of a life she was no longer certain how to define. She was not divorced, not yet. The legal and practical realities of ending a marriage that had also been a business arrangement between two families, proving far more complicated than the emotional decision itself. But something fundamental had shifted, and Maya found herself, almost without deciding to, beginning to rebuild pieces of herself that had been quietly set aside for 6 years. She returned to painting seriously, no longer as an occasional escape, but as something she pursued with real discipline, spending hours in the small upstairs room that had once been Daniel's blind spot and had now become her sanctuary. She reached out to an old professor from the college program she had left unfinished years earlier, asking, tentatively, whether it might still be possible to complete her degree. The answer, encouragingly, was yes, and within a month, Maya had enrolled in evening classes, sitting in lecture halls beside students years younger than herself, feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, the particular alive sensation of building a future she was actually choosing for herself. She spent more time with Claire, and through Claire, reconnected with old friends she had gradually drifted from during the years she had poured herself entirely into a marriage that gave so little back. She was surprised at first by how easily some of those friendships resumed, as if the years of distance had simply been paused rather than ended, and she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, laughing freely, without the careful, managed quality her laughter had taken on during her marriage. Daniel called more frequently as the weeks passed, his voice each time carrying a mixture of guilt and something that sounded, increasingly, like genuine longing. He asked, several times, if they could talk in person, properly, about what came next. Maya agreed eventually, not because she had decided anything yet about the future of their marriage, but because she recognized, with the new clarity she had gained, that avoiding the conversation entirely would only prolong an uncertainty that served no one. They met at a quiet cafe neither of them had been to before. Neutral ground, away from the house that still held 6 years of complicated history between its walls. Daniel looked different somehow, Maya thought, watching him settle into the seat across from her. Thinner, more tired, but also, strangely, more present than she remembered him being in a very long time. "I ended things with Priya," he said, before she had even ordered her coffee, as if the words had been building pressure in him for weeks and needed to escape immediately. "Not because I think it fixes anything, but because I realized, once everything came apart, that what I felt for her was never really about her. It was about needing to feel chosen by someone, and I picked the easiest version of that, instead of doing the hard work of actually being present for the marriage I already had." Maya listened without responding immediately, watching him carefully, trying to gauge whether the words carried the weight of genuine understanding, or whether they were simply another performance, another version of the man who had once told her, calmly, over a candlelit dinner years earlier, exactly how little he intended to give. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," Daniel continued, when she remained quiet. "I know I don't deserve that, not yet, maybe not ever. But I wanted you to know that I see it now, Maya. I see what I did to you. Not just with Priya, but every year before that too. I see how much you gave, and how little I let myself receive it. I don't know if there's a version of us that can survive what I've done. But I wanted to at least be honest with you about wanting to try, if you're even willing to consider it." Maya sat with his words for a long moment, feeling the weight of 6 years pressing against the fragile new life she had begun building in the weeks since that night in the living room. Part of her, the part that had spent years hoping desperately for exactly this kind of honesty from him, felt something soften at his words. But a larger, steadier part of her, the part that had painted alone in a small upstairs room for 6 years, while he slept in a guest room down the hall, recognized something important that she had not fully understood until this very moment, sitting across from him in a cafe that held none of the history their house did. She no longer needed his apology to feel whole. She had spent 6 years believing that her worth depended on whether Daniel eventually chose to see her, to value her, to give back even a fraction of what she had given him. But somewhere in the weeks since the truth had come out, somewhere between the painting and the classes and the laughter with old friends, Maya had quietly, without fully realizing it was happening, stopped waiting for his validation to determine her own sense of self. "I appreciate you saying that," she told him finally. "I do. But I don't think I can answer you today, Daniel. And I don't think that's because I need more time to decide how I feel about you. I think it's because, for the first time in 6 years, I'm not building my life around what you decide to give me. I'm building it around what I actually want, and I need to figure out what that looks like before I can know if there's room in it for you." Daniel nodded slowly, something that looked like both disappointment and respect crossing his face in equal measure. "That's fair," he said quietly. "More than fair." They parted that afternoon without resolution, without the clean ending or clean beginning either of them might once have wanted, and Maya drove home alone through streets that felt, somehow, less lonely than they ever had during the 6 years she had shared a house with a man who was rarely truly present in it. Months passed, and Maya's life continued to take shape in ways that surprised even her. She completed her remaining coursework with a discipline that impressed her professors, several of whom encouraged her to pursue her art more seriously, mentioning gallery contacts and local exhibitions she had never imagined might be within reach. She began selling small pieces through a local gallery downtown, nothing extravagant, but enough to feel, for the first time, that the thing she loved most could also be something the world valued. She moved out of the house she had shared with Daniel, choosing instead a modest apartment closer to Claire, smaller than the home the Hartleys had purchased for her wedding, but filled, room by room, with choices that were entirely her own. She painted the walls colors Daniel would never have approved of, colors that felt alive, rather than tasteful and neutral. She hung her own paintings on the walls, finished pieces she had once hidden away in a small upstairs room, now displayed proudly where she could see them every morning when she woke. Daniel remained a presence in her life during those months, though a very different one than he had been during their marriage. He called occasionally, always respectful of the boundaries Maya had set, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. He attended family gatherings alongside her when necessary, since the business relationship between their families had not fully dissolved even as their marriage remained in a suspended, unresolved state, neither fully ended nor fully continued. At one such gathering, months after their conversation at the cafe, Edwin Hartley pulled Maya aside quietly, away from the noise of the extended family, and said something that stayed with her long afterward. "I owe you an apology," the old man said, his voice softer than Maya had ever heard it. "I arranged this marriage because I believed a wife would fix something in my son that I had failed to fix myself. I never once considered what it might cost you, only what I hoped it might give him. I was wrong to think of you that way, and I'm sorry." Maya thanked him, genuinely moved by the admission, though she noticed, with a clarity that had become second nature to her over the past year, that even this apology centered Daniel's need rather than her own experience. It was, she realized, simply how the Hartley family had always operated, weighing every decision by what it might provide for Daniel, rarely pausing to consider the person standing beside him. Understanding this did not make her angry anymore. It simply helped her understand, more fully, the shape of the marriage she had endured, and the shape of the life she was determined not to repeat. It was around this time that Daniel asked, again, if they might try counseling together, a suggestion that surprised Maya, coming from a man who had spent years avoiding any conversation that required emotional vulnerability. She agreed, cautiously, not because she was certain of what she wanted their future to hold, but because she recognized, honestly, that she owed it to herself to explore every possibility before making a final decision about a marriage that had defined 6 significant years of her life. The counseling sessions were difficult, more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Daniel, for the first time, spoke openly about the pressure of his childhood, the impossible standards his father had set for him, the way he had learned early to protect himself by keeping people at a careful, manageable distance, a habit that had followed him directly into his marriage with Maya, without him ever fully recognizing what he was doing. Maya, in turn, spoke about the years of quiet erosion, the slow disappearing of herself that had happened not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulated weight of thousands of small moments, where she had been overlooked, dismissed, treated as an afterthought, in a life she had sacrificed so much to build. The therapist, a calm, perceptive woman named Diane, asked Maya a question during one session that Maya found herself returning to again and again in the weeks that followed. "If Daniel became everything you once hoped he would be," Diane asked gently, "would you still want him? Or have you built a life now that no longer needs him to complete it?" Maya sat with the question for a long moment before answering, aware that her answer would matter more than almost anything else she said during their sessions together. "I think," she said slowly, "I spent 6 years needing him to complete something in me that I didn't know how to build myself. And now that I've started building it, I'm not sure I need him to complete it anymore. I might still want him, if he's willing to actually show up, but I don't need him the way I used to, and I think that difference matters more than anything else we could talk about in this room." Daniel, sitting beside her, absorbed this answer quietly, and Maya could see, in the careful way he studied his hands afterward, that some part of him understood exactly what she meant, and understood, too, that it represented both a genuine opening and a genuine risk. The woman he had married out of obligation, the woman who had waited patiently for years hoping he might eventually choose to see her, no longer existed in quite the same way. In her place was someone steadier, someone who had built an identity independent of his approval, someone who might still choose him, but only if he proved, consistently and over time, that he deserved to be chosen, rather than simply waited for. The sessions continued for several more months, slow and imperfect, filled with setbacks, alongside small, genuine breakthroughs. Daniel began showing up in ways Maya had once desperately wished for during their marriage, remembering small details about her days, asking real questions, and actually listening to the answers, making space in his schedule not out of obligation but, it seemed, out of genuine desire to understand the woman he had spent 6 years failing to truly see. Maya watched this transformation with careful, guarded hope, aware that she had been disappointed before by moments of change that had ultimately proven temporary, tied to crisis rather than to any lasting shift in Daniel himself. She did not rush toward reconciliation, simply because he was finally offering the things she had once wanted so badly. Instead, she watched, patiently, but from a place of strength rather than desperation, waiting to see whether this version of Daniel could sustain itself, once the immediate crisis of their marriage's collapse had settled into something more ordinary, more sustainable, more like actual daily life. It was a different kind of waiting than the waiting that had defined her marriage for 6 years. This waiting did not cost her anything. She was not shrinking herself to make space for it, not organizing her entire identity around its outcome. She was simply living her life, fully and completely, while leaving a door open, cautiously, to see what might walk through it. Maya's first solo exhibition took place in early autumn, a small gallery show downtown, featuring a collection of paintings she had created over the past year. Pieces that traced, in color and shape rather than words, the journey she had traveled, from quiet erosion to something that finally felt like restoration. She had not intended, when she first picked up a brush again in that small upstairs room, for her work to become a kind of public record of her transformation, but looking around the gallery on opening night, watching strangers pause thoughtfully in front of paintings that captured feelings she had once believed were hers alone, she understood that something honest and true had emerged from the hardest years of her life. Claire stood beside her throughout the evening, beaming with pride, introducing Maya to friends and acquaintances, with an enthusiasm that made Maya laugh more than once. Her father arrived early and stayed late, moving slowly from painting to painting, studying each one with the same careful attention he had once given to pieces of furniture in his workshop, and Maya noticed, watching him, that his eyes lingered longest on a piece near the back of the gallery, an abstract work in blues and grays that she had painted during the loneliest stretch of her marriage, before any of this transformation had begun. "This one," he said quietly, when she came to stand beside him. "This is the year I almost lost you, isn't it? Not physically, but the year you almost disappeared." Maya nodded, unable to speak for a moment, surprised by how accurately he had read something she had never explained to anyone in words. "I'm glad you didn't," he said simply, and pulled her into a hug that said everything neither of them needed to put into language. Daniel came to the exhibition too, arriving quietly partway through the evening, dressed carefully, but without the polished, distant formality that had once characterized nearly everything about him. Maya watched him move through the gallery from a distance, noting the way he studied each painting, with real attention, rather than polite obligation, pausing longest, as her father had, in front of the pieces that had clearly emerged from the darkest years of their marriage. He found her eventually, near the end of the evening, once most of the guests had thinned out, and the gallery had grown quiet enough for real conversation. "These are extraordinary," he said, and there was no performance in his voice, only genuine, quiet awe. "I had no idea, Maya, that you were capable of this. I mean, I knew you painted, but I never understood what it actually meant to you, what you were actually creating in that room I never once walked into." "You never asked," Maya said, not unkindly, simply stating a fact that had shaped 6 years of her life. "I know," he said. "I think about that a lot now. All the rooms in our life I never bothered to walk into, not just the literal one upstairs, but all the parts of you I never made space to understand. I was so focused on surviving my own obligation to the marriage that I never once considered what it might feel like to actually be curious about the person I'd married." Maya studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the months of careful, gradual change she had witnessed since their counseling sessions began. She thought about the woman she had been on their wedding day, hopeful and naive, believing that patience alone could build love out of obligation. She thought about the woman she had been on the night she watched him disappear through a restaurant's side entrance, heartbroken but no longer surprised. And she thought about the woman standing in this gallery tonight, surrounded by proof of everything she had built for herself in the wreckage of that discovery, no longer needing anyone's validation to know her own worth. "I'm proud of who I've become this year," she said finally. "I want you to know that, whatever happens next between us. I'm not the same person who married you, Daniel, and I don't think I want to be her again, even if things work out between us." "I don't want you to be her again either," Daniel said, and something in the quiet sincerity of his voice made Maya believe him more than she had believed almost anything he had said in the 6 years before. "I think I fell in love with this version of you, honestly, somewhere in the middle of watching you rebuild everything I helped tear down. I know I don't have the right to say that yet, not fully, not until I've proven it means something beyond words. But I wanted you to know it's true." Maya did not answer immediately. She let the words settle, testing them against everything she had learned to trust, and everything she had learned, painfully, to be cautious of. The old version of herself, the one who had waited desperately for exactly these words for 6 long years, might have rushed toward them, grateful simply to finally be chosen. But the woman standing in this gallery, surrounded by paintings that represented her own hard-won reclamation of self, understood that Daniel's love, however genuine it might now be, could no longer be the foundation her worth depended on. "I hear you," she said finally, "and I believe you mean it. Right now, in this moment. But love isn't proven in a single moment, Daniel. It's proven over years, the way its absence was proven over years too. If you want a future with me, you're going to have to keep choosing me, every single day, the way I once tried to choose you, without ever asking whether you were choosing me back." Daniel nodded slowly, something that looked like genuine understanding, perhaps even genuine hope, crossing his face. "I can do that," he said. "I want to do that." "Then show me," Maya said simply. "Not tonight, not with words. Show me, over time, and we'll see what we've actually built." She left the gallery that evening surrounded by friends and family who loved her, carrying with her not the desperate hope of a woman waiting to be chosen, but the steady confidence of a woman who had finally, completely, learned how to choose herself. The year that followed tested every promise Daniel had made in that quiet gallery conversation, and to Maya's genuine surprise, he did not falter the way she had privately, cautiously, expected him to. He showed up in small, consistent ways that mattered far more than any grand gesture could have. He remembered the dates of her gallery showings without needing reminders, arriving early to help her set up rather than simply appearing at the end. He asked about her painting process with real curiosity, learning enough about her technique to ask questions that showed he had actually been listening rather than performing interest. He also did the harder, less visible work, continuing counseling sessions even after the immediate crisis of their marriage had passed, using the time to keep excavating the childhood patterns that had shaped his instinct toward distance. He reached out to his father directly, in conversations Maya was not present for but heard about afterward, addressing years of impossible expectations that had taught him early to protect himself by keeping everyone, eventually including his own wife, at arm's length. It was slow, uncomfortable work, and Maya watched him struggle through it with a kind of respect she had not expected to feel again. Respect, not because he was perfect, but because he was finally, genuinely trying, in ways he had never tried during the years they were legally, if not truly, married. Maya, for her part, did not abandon the life she had built for herself in order to make room for this new version of their relationship. She continued her exhibitions, her classes, her expanding friendships, refusing to let the slow rebuilding of trust with Daniel become another version of the old pattern where her own life shrank to accommodate his. She insisted, and Daniel agreed without argument, that they take things slowly, that they date each other properly this time, without the pressure of an existing marriage or family obligation dictating the terms. It was during this careful, deliberate rebuilding that Priya's name came up one final time, in a conversation Maya had not expected but had, in some quiet way, been waiting for. Daniel brought it up himself, unprompted, sitting across from her at a small restaurant they had chosen together, neither the cafe of their earlier conversation, nor any place tied to the painful memories of the past. "I ran into her a few weeks ago," he said carefully, watching Maya's reaction. "At a work conference. It was brief, professional. But I wanted you to know, rather than have you wonder if I was hiding it." Maya appreciated the honesty more than she could easily express, recognizing in it a version of Daniel who had genuinely absorbed the lessons of the past painful year, a man who now understood that trust was built through transparency rather than convenient silence. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "How did it feel, seeing her?" Daniel considered the question seriously before answering. "Strange," he admitted, "like looking at a chapter of my life I'm not proud of. One I understand now was really about my own fear rather than about her, or about you, or about anything real. I don't feel anything for her anymore, Maya, if that's what you're asking. But I also don't want to pretend it never happened, or that it didn't cause real damage. I think acknowledging it, rather than burying it, is part of actually becoming someone different, Maya nodded, satisfied by an answer that felt earned rather than rehearsed, and their conversation moved on, easily, to other things. The exhibition she was preparing for the following month, a documentary they had both watched separately and wanted to discuss. Small, ordinary pieces of a life being built together on genuinely equal footing for what felt, to both of them, like the very first time. It was nearly 18 months after that night in the living room, the night Maya had sat waiting in the dark with clarity instead of tears, when Daniel finally asked her the question that would define the next chapter of their story. They were sitting on a bench overlooking the same lake from that early hopeful trip years earlier, having returned there together, deliberately, to see whether the place still held any of the meaning it once had, or whether they could build something entirely new upon its memory. "I know we're not officially divorced," Daniel said, his voice carrying a nervousness Maya had rarely heard from him. "I know the legal side of things has been complicated, tied up with the business and both our families. But I want to ask you something, Maya, not as the husband my father arranged for you, but as the man who spent the last year and a half trying to become someone worthy of actually being chosen by you. Would you consider staying married to me, not out of obligation this time, but because you actually want to build a real life together?" Maya looked out at the water, remembering the young, hopeful woman who had sat on this same shore years earlier, believing that patience alone could transform an arrangement into love. That woman had waited desperately, shrinking herself into whatever shape might finally earn Daniel's attention. The woman sitting here now was different, steadier, whole in ways that no longer depended on his answer to determine her own worth. "I'm not the same person who married you," she said finally, turning to look at him directly. "I want you to understand that clearly, before you ask me this question. I've built a life I love, independent of you, and I'm not willing to shrink it again for anyone, including you." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm not asking you to shrink anything. I'm asking if there's room in the life you've built for someone who's finally learned how to actually show up in it." Maya considered the question carefully, weighing it not against the desperate hope of her early marriage, but against the clear, grounded understanding she had earned through everything that followed. She thought about the year and a half of consistent, patient effort Daniel had offered, effort that had asked nothing of her in return, except honesty about what she actually wanted. She thought about her own transformation, the exhibitions, the friendships, the sense of self she had rebuilt from nothing, and she understood that whatever she decided now, she would decide it from a place of genuine choice, rather than desperate need. "Yes," she said finally, quietly, but with a certainty that surprised even herself. "There's room. But only because I'm choosing it, Daniel, not because I need it. There's a difference now, and I need you to always remember that difference, every single day going forward." Daniel took her hand then, the same lake stretching out before them that had once held the fragile beginning of a hope that was cruelly withdrawn. And Maya understood, sitting there, that this time the hope she felt was different, built not on waiting, but on genuine, mutual choice. The kind of foundation her marriage had never once had, until she had finally, completely, stopped waiting for it to be given to her and started building it for herself instead. 2 years after that conversation on the lakeshore, Maya stood in the same gallery downtown where her first solo exhibition had once marked the beginning of her rediscovered self, this time surrounded by an even larger collection of work, paintings that traced a fuller arc now, from quiet erosion, through heartbreak, through slow, patient rebuilding, and finally into something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine joy. The gallery was full that evening, filled with friends, family, collectors who had followed her work since that first modest show, and Daniel, standing near the entrance, greeting guests with an ease and warmth that would have seemed impossible to the man Maya had married nearly a decade earlier. Their marriage, rebuilt on entirely different foundations than the one that had begun it, had settled into something neither of them had believed possible during the darkest years of quiet obligation and silence. It was not perfect, Maya had learned, because no real marriage between two whole, complicated people ever truly was. But it was honest, and it was equal, and it was built, every single day, on genuine choice, rather than desperate hope. Her father moved through the gallery slowly that evening, older now, his health carefully managed but stable, pausing longest in front of a large painting near the center of the room, one Maya had completed only months earlier. It showed a woman standing alone on a dock beneath a wide, star-filled sky, her posture not lonely but peaceful, rooted, entirely present in her own solitude. "This one," he said, when Maya came to stand beside him. "This is you now, isn't it? Not waiting for anyone to arrive. Just being exactly who you are." Maya smiled, looking at the painting with the same clear-eyed understanding she had carried through every difficult year that led to this moment. "It's me, at every point along the way," she said. "The waiting, the breaking, the rebuilding. But mostly, yes, it's who I finally learned to become." Claire found her a little later, wrapping her in a tight hug, tears of genuine pride shining in her eyes. "I remember when you used to talk about him like he was a job you were failing at," she said quietly. "Look at you now. Look at everything you built." Maya thought about that observation for a long moment, watching Daniel across the room, laughing easily with her father over something she could not hear, a scene that would have seemed entirely impossible during the years of cold silence and separate bedrooms that had once defined her marriage. She thought about the young woman who had walked down the aisle nearly a decade earlier, believing patience alone could transform obligation into love. She thought about the woman who had sat alone in a dark living room, waiting with clarity instead of tears, finally understanding the true shape of what she had married into. And she thought about herself now, standing in a gallery full of her own hard-won creative work, married still to the same man, but to an entirely different marriage, one built not on sacrifice and quiet endurance, but on mutual, ongoing, deliberate choice. The lesson she had learned, she understood now, was not that love could not grow from difficult beginnings, though hers eventually had, slowly and imperfectly, and only after everything had first fallen completely apart. The real lesson, the one she carried with her every single day now, painted quietly into the corners of every canvas she created, was that waiting for someone else to see her worth had never once been the answer. Her worth had always been hers to claim, independent of whether anyone else chose to recognize it, and only once she had stopped waiting for Daniel's validation to complete her, had she become capable of building a life, and eventually a marriage, that was genuinely, fully her own. Later that evening, as the gallery began to empty and the last guests said their goodbyes, Daniel found her standing quietly in front of the painting of the woman on the dock, and he slipped his hand into hers, not out of obligation, not out of habit, but out of the simple, ordinary choice of a man who had finally, after everything, learned how to actually show up for the woman standing beside him. "I used to think I married you out of obligation," he said quietly, looking at the painting alongside her. "I know now that was only ever true for a very small part of our story. The rest of it, the real marriage we have now, I chose. Every single day, I keep choosing it." Maya leaned into him slightly, feeling the steady warmth of a partnership finally built on equal ground, and looked once more at the painting of the woman on the dock, rooted and whole, and entirely at peace with herself, waiting for no one, because she had finally, completely, learned that she never needed to. "That's the only kind of marriage worth having," she said softly. "The kind that's chosen, again and again, by two people who finally learned to see each other clearly." And standing there together in the quiet gallery, surrounded by years of hard-won transformation rendered in color and light, Maya understood, with a certainty that no longer needed anyone else's approval to feel true, that she had finally built the life she had once only dared to hope for, not because she had waited long enough for someone else to give it to her, but because she had, at exactly the right moment, finally stopped waiting and started building it herself.